A young man was compelled to marry a feared widow in the Old West. No one expected what he would do next. Caleb had always been known as a quiet, hard-working young man. In the small, dusty town where he lived, there were few people who could match his honesty and dedication. He spent his days caring for horses, fixing broken fences, and running errands for the townspeople. Though the work was tiring, Caleb liked the steady rhythm of his life. The smell of hay in the mornings, the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, and the occasional whistle of a wind-blown bird made his simple life feel peaceful. He had dreams, of course, dreams that went beyond the edges of the town. He often imagined leaving this place behind, traveling to a bigger city, learning new skills, and seeing a world full of opportunity. But for now, those dreams remained quiet wishes he held close in his heart. Life, after all, demanded attention to the present, not distant horizons. The town itself was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Stories traveled fast here, often twisted in the retelling. People loved gossip almost as much as they loved their morning coffee. And in this town there was no subject more spoken of than Eleanor Voss, the widow who lived on the outskirts. Eleanor had been widowed twice, and while no one could say exactly what had happened to her husbands, the people of the town had formed their own stories. Some whispered that she brought bad luck. Others claimed she had cursed the men who had married her. Children were warned to avoid her, and even adults crossed the street rather than pass by her house. She was a figure of mystery, shadowed by fear, and for a long time Caleb had given little thought to her, except to notice the caution with which townsfolk spoke her name. Then, one day, everything changed for Caleb. The town's wealthiest landowner, a man whose word often decided the fate of families, called him to his office. The room was small and stuffy, the kind of place where business deals and ultimatums were delivered without ceremony. Caleb entered nervously, unsure of why he had been summoned. The landowner wasted no time. With a firm voice and no hint of warmth, he told Caleb that he was to marry Eleanor Voss. Caleb froze, his mind racing. He had heard the rumors, seen the fearful glances cast toward her house, and yet now he was being told that this was his future. He protested softly, explaining that he hardly knew her, that he had dreams of leaving the town, and that he had never thought of marriage at all. But his objections were brushed aside. The landowner reminded him of his family's debts, the favors they owed, and the unspoken consequences of refusal. Caleb had no choice. The town had handed him a path, and he could either walk it or lose everything. As the wedding day approached, Caleb felt trapped by a weight he could hardly explain. Each step toward the inevitable ceremony felt heavier than the last. His family, though understanding, could only offer quiet sympathy. They had lived under the town's rules for years, and they knew better than to argue with those in power. Caleb found little comfort in their support. Instead, he spent hours wandering the streets, trying to gather courage, trying to imagine what it would be like to share his life with a woman he barely knew and whom everyone feared. He wondered what Eleanor thought of the situation. Was she terrified, angry, or resigned? Would she see him as another burden imposed by circumstances? These questions haunted him, yet no one could answer them but Eleanor herself. On the morning of the wedding, the town seemed unusually quiet. A thin mist clung to the ground, and the sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting a pale light over the dusty streets. Caleb dressed in a suit that had been pressed and cleaned the night before, feeling the stiffness of the fabric against his skin like a reminder of the ceremony's rigidity. He adjusted his collar and tried to steady his hands, though they trembled slightly. The chapel itself was small, with plain wooden benches and a simple altar. It smelled faintly of candle wax and old wood, and the echo of each footstep seemed louder than it should have been. Outside, townspeople began to gather. Some looked at Caleb with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with barely disguised amusement. Everyone seemed to want to witness the young man's fate. Then Eleanor arrived. She appeared at the chapel doors with a calmness that made the crowd shift uneasily. She wore a modest black dress, simple but elegant, and her hair was tied neatly back. There was no grand display, no parade of flowers or music to soften her presence. She walked slowly, deliberately, her eyes fixed forward, revealing nothing of what she felt. The townspeople whispered among themselves. Some said she looked like a queen of misfortune, others simply looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Caleb felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. The rumors had painted her as terrifying, yet now, seeing her in person, he felt something more complex, a quiet strength, a controlled and serious presence that demanded attention. Inside the chapel, the ceremony began with a brief prayer from the local pastor. His voice trembled slightly, betraying either his nerves or discomfort with the unusual situation. Caleb and Eleanor stood facing each other. He noticed the way she held herself, straight and composed, as if the weight of years had shaped her posture into something formidable. He struggled to find words to say, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Eleanor responded in kind, her tone calm and steady. There was no warmth, no flourish of affection, but neither was there hostility. It was as if both understood that this union was not born of desire, but of necessity. And perhaps that understanding made the silence between them easier to bear. The vows were short, almost mechanical. Caleb repeated the words as best he could, feeling the enormity of the moment press down on him. Eleanor's voice was clear, firm, yet measured, and when she spoke, it sounded like she had spoken these words before in her mind many times. There was no display of emotion, no tears, no trembling, no smiles, and in that simplicity lay an intensity that was almost frightening. When the ceremony concluded, the pastor's hands trembled slightly as he declared them married. Caleb felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The formalities were over, but the reality of the future that awaited him had only just begun. As they left the chapel, the townspeople watched in silence. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered in hushed tones, and a few simply turned away, unwilling to see what had become of the young man. Caleb walked beside Eleanor, feeling the weight of the town's eyes upon him. He glanced at her once, trying to read her expression, but it remained inscrutable, calm and composed. He realized that from this moment forward their lives were linked in ways he could not yet imagine, bound by circumstance rather than choice. As they mounted the horse-drawn carriage that would take them to Eleanor's home, Caleb felt a surge of determination. He did not know what awaited him beyond the town limits, but he knew that whatever it was, he would face it. And he could not shake the feeling that the world outside the town, the endless plains and hidden possibilities, might not be as far away as he had once believed. The journey to Eleanor's home was quiet. Caleb and Eleanor did not speak much, each lost in their own thoughts. The carriage rattled over the uneven road, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a gray haze. Caleb studied the land as they rode, noticing the sparse trees, the stretches of dry grass, and the distant hills. He wondered what life would be like here, in isolation, with a woman whose past was shrouded in fear and rumor. He thought about the future, about the long days and nights ahead, and about how he might navigate a world that seemed determined to define Eleanor by stories rather than by truth. When the carriage finally approached Eleanor's property, a large weathered house stood at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by a wooden fence. The wind blew across the plains, making the fence creak and the trees whisper. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Eleanor remained silent beside him, her eyes fixed on the house. For a brief moment, Caleb wondered what lay behind those walls. What stories did the house hold? What secrets did Eleanor carry? And as the carriage doors opened and he stepped down into the dusty yard, he realized that the life he had known, simple, predictable, and safe, had come to an end. From this point forward, everything would change. No one in the town expected what would come next. The whispers, the fear, and the stories all pointed toward disaster. Caleb's friends and neighbors shook their heads, some offering quiet condolences, others simply avoiding his gaze. But Caleb did not feel despair. He felt a strange mixture of fear, curiosity, and determination. He knew that the days ahead would test him in ways he had never imagined, but he also knew that he had a choice, not about the marriage itself, but about what kind of man he would be in the face of uncertainty. And as he stepped toward Eleanor's house, he could not know that this choice would set the stage for a story that no one in the town could have predicted, a story that would challenge rumors, defy expectations, and reveal truths hidden beneath fear. The house at the edge of the clearing was older than most in the town, built from rough-hewn timber that had darkened over the years. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the wooden boards creaked whenever the wind blew across the plains. Yet, despite its age, the home had an undeniable presence, standing tall and solid like a silent guardian of the surrounding land. Caleb stepped down from the carriage and felt the dust stick to his boots. The sun was beginning to sink low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, and for a moment he felt the weight of solitude settle around him. This was Eleanor's world, a place that belonged to her and her alone. Every step he took felt like crossing into territory that was both mysterious and forbidding. Eleanor opened the front door with a calm, steady motion. The interior of the house was surprisingly neat. The floors were swept, the furniture polished, and the air smelled faintly of herbs and wood smoke. Caleb realized that everything in this home had a place, and everything was cared for. There was no dust covering the shelves, no cobwebs in the corners, only a quiet order that suggested careful daily attention. The light from the setting sun filtered through small windows, casting a warm glow across the room. Caleb noticed a few personal touches, like a vase with dried flowers on a table and a small quilt folded neatly on a chair. These details made the house feel lived in, but they also hinted at the precision and control of someone who had endured years of isolation. Eleanor spoke to him in a calm voice, giving directions with a tone that was neither harsh nor cold. She explained where he could put his belongings, how the daily routines worked, and what tasks were expected of him. There was no warmth, no small talk, no attempt to make him feel immediately welcome. Yet, Caleb felt no hostility either. She treated him as a guest might be treated in someone else's home, with measured courtesy, but with a clear understanding that this was her space and he was now part of it. He followed her instructions carefully, trying not to make mistakes, aware that every action would be observed and silently judged. The first night in the house was strange for Caleb. The rooms were quiet, too quiet, with only the sound of wind outside and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. He lay awake in the modest bedroom assigned to him, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked and the wind rattled the window pane. He tried to imagine what Eleanor might be doing in the other rooms, whether she was resting, planning her day, or simply sitting in silence as she often seemed to do. The air felt heavy with expectation and uncertainty, and Caleb found it difficult to sleep. Yet beneath his anxiety there was also a flicker of curiosity. He wanted to know the woman he had been forced to marry, to understand the strength and mystery that everyone in town feared. Days passed slowly at first, filled with routine and quiet observation. Caleb rose early to tend to the animals, feed the chickens, and repair broken fences. He carried water from the well, chopped firewood, and mended tools. Eleanor remained mostly inside, caring for the home and the small vegetable garden, though she occasionally accompanied him outside to check on the work. Their interactions were brief and functional, limited to instructions, questions about the chores, and occasional small remarks about the weather or the state of the land. Caleb often found himself wishing for conversation, for some sign of connection, yet he also respected her silence, realizing that trust could not be rushed. Despite the stillness, Caleb began to notice small, unexpected gestures from Eleanor. Once, when he had cut his hand while repairing a fence, she quietly brought a bowl of warm water and bandages. She cleaned the wound with careful precision, speaking only to instruct him not to move too quickly. There was no fuss, no dramatics, but her actions carried a subtle kindness. Another time, during a particularly hot afternoon, she brought him a glass of water without being asked, her expression calm but thoughtful. Caleb began to see that her fearsome reputation might have been exaggerated by the townspeople. Here, in her own home, Eleanor showed a side that was disciplined, measured, but not cruel. Over the following weeks, Caleb grew accustomed to the rhythms of life on the property. The mornings were for chores, the afternoons for repairs or tending the garden, and the evenings for meals and quiet reflection. Eleanor moved through the house with a precision that made everything seem effortless, yet Caleb could tell that it required effort to maintain. She had learned to manage both the land and herself, and in doing so, she had created a space that was orderly, safe, and resilient. Caleb admired her strength, though he would never have admitted it aloud. He also began to sense that Eleanor's fearsome image in town was partly the result of misunderstanding, and partly the result of deliberate distance. People feared what they did not understand. One evening, a storm rolled in from the plains. Dark clouds gathered quickly, and the wind howled through the trees. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, pounding on the roof and making the wooden floors tremble. Caleb rushed to secure the barn, struggling against the wind and rain as it tore at his clothing. By the time he returned to the house, he was soaked to the bone, shivering and exhausted. To his surprise, Eleanor was waiting at the door with a lantern and a warm drink. She handed it to him without a word, her calm demeanor unchanged by the storm. Caleb accepted it gratefully, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine comfort. He realized that Eleanor had been watching over him quietly, ensuring his safety in her own measured way. As the days turned into weeks, a cautious understanding began to develop between them. They began to speak more often, though still in careful, limited exchanges. Caleb asked questions about the property, the animals, and the routines. Eleanor responded with short, factual answers, but there was a growing warmth beneath her words, a subtle acknowledgement of his presence. Caleb listened carefully, learning not just about the chores, but about Eleanor herself. He discovered that she had a sharp mind, practical skills, and a deep understanding of the land. Her silence, he realized, was not a lack of communication, but a form of observation, a way to assess and understand the world around her before acting. Despite this progress, the town's whispers still haunted Caleb. He occasionally rode into town to fetch supplies, and each visit reminded him of the fear and suspicion that clung to Eleanor's name. Neighbors averted their eyes, shopkeepers exchanged cautious glances, and children whispered as he passed. Caleb tried not to let it bother him, but he could not ignore the tension. He began to wonder how Eleanor had endured years of isolation, judged unfairly by people who knew little of her life, and he began to understand that his presence might not only change his own life, but hers as well. Their forced marriage, which had seemed like a punishment at first, was slowly revealing a different truth, the possibility of companionship, respect, and even understanding. One afternoon, while repairing a broken section of fence, Caleb paused to watch Eleanor tending the garden. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the field, and the air smelled of fresh earth and rain from the previous night. Eleanor moved with a quiet grace, her hands skilled and precise as she worked. Caleb realized that, for all the fear the town had instilled in him, Eleanor was not a figure to be afraid of. She was a survivor, a woman who had learned to navigate life on her own terms. He felt a surge of admiration and a desire to protect her, to stand beside her rather than simply endure the circumstances of their marriage. As night fell, Caleb and Eleanor shared a simple meal. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the chill outside. They spoke about small things, the weather, the animals, the best way to mend a fence. There was no talk of love, no declarations of sentiment, but there was connection, a quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. Caleb realized that trust could grow slowly, in small gestures and shared experiences, rather than in grand declarations or dramatic actions. And in this realization he felt hope that the future, though uncertain, might hold more than he had imagined. By the end of the first month, Caleb had begun to feel a sense of belonging in the house at the edge of the clearing. He understood the routines, the rhythms of the land, and the subtle ways Eleanor communicated without words. He had learned that she was not the fearful figure the town had made her out to be, but a woman of strength, intelligence, and quiet compassion. And he had begun to wonder if the forced marriage, which had seemed like a punishment, might actually be an opportunity to build something meaningful in a place that few dared to understand. In the silence of the house, in the creaking of the floors, in the wind that swept across the plains, Caleb felt the first stirrings of connection. The walls that Eleanor had built around herself were high, but he sensed that they were not unbreakable. And as he lay in bed that night, listening to the distant howl of wolves and the gentle rustle of the trees, he realized that the story of this house, this widow, and his own life was only beginning. The days ahead promised challenges, discoveries, and perhaps even unexpected friendship or trust. And though the town would continue to whisper, Caleb knew that within these walls he had a chance to see the truth, and perhaps to rewrite the story that everyone else had already decided. As the weeks turned into months, Caleb began to understand that life with Eleanor was far more complex than he had ever imagined. Their days had settled into a steady rhythm, the chores and routines creating a quiet stability. Caleb rose early each morning to tend to the animals, repair fences, and maintain the small fields of crops. Eleanor, meanwhile, managed the house, cooked meals, and carefully tended her garden. At first, their conversations had been short and functional, limited to the necessities of life on the farm. But over time, they began to speak more, cautiously, deliberately, yet with a growing sense of understanding. Caleb discovered that Eleanor's silence was not the sign of a cold or cruel woman, as the townspeople claimed, but the mark of someone who had endured great hardship and had learned to rely on observation and thought rather than words. She was precise in her movements and decisions, never acting without consideration. She did not speak unnecessarily, but when she did, her words carried weight. Caleb began to respect her intelligence and foresight, realizing that the strength she had displayed throughout her life had been misinterpreted by others as something frightening. In truth, Eleanor had faced challenges that most in town could never imagine, and she had survived each one with courage and dignity. One afternoon, as Caleb was mending a broken gate, Eleanor approached him carrying a basket of freshly picked vegetables. She handed him a bundle of carrots and smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "The soil is better near the fence," she said quietly. "You might have better luck planting there." Caleb nodded, touched by the thoughtfulness of her suggestion. It was such a small gesture, yet it carried a significance he could not ignore. He realized that Eleanor was not only capable of surviving on her own, but also capable of guiding and helping him. The woman everyone feared was quietly shaping their shared life in ways he had never expected. As Caleb worked alongside her in the garden, they began to share small stories of their pasts. Eleanor spoke of her childhood in a nearby town, of her parents who had taught her the value of hard work and self-reliance. She told him about the dreams she had once held, dreams that had been cut short by loss and circumstance. Caleb listened intently, surprised by the depth and sincerity of her words. He had expected a bitter, harsh woman, but instead he found someone with resilience, wisdom, and a quiet kindness that had been hidden behind a wall of silence and fear. The rumors that had followed her all these years seemed increasingly unfounded in the light of these revelations. Caleb, in turn, shared his own experiences. He spoke of his desire to see the world beyond the town, of his hopes to learn and grow, and of the simple pleasures he enjoyed, the sound of horses' hooves, the smell of fresh earth after rain, and the satisfaction of a day's honest work. Eleanor listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking questions, her expression thoughtful. Through these exchanges, a cautious bond began to form between them, built not on romance or obligation, but on mutual respect and understanding. Despite the growing connection between them, Caleb could not ignore the shadow of the town's opinion. When he rode into town for supplies, he was reminded of the whispers and sideways glances that greeted him. Some townspeople seemed to take pleasure in watching him live with Eleanor, as if waiting for him to fail or regret his decision. Children pointed and whispered, and adults murmured in corners. Caleb felt a mixture of frustration and determination. He knew that the fear surrounding Eleanor was largely the product of rumor and misunderstanding, and he resolved not to let it dictate their lives. He began to see that his role was not merely to survive the forced marriage, but to protect and stand by Eleanor, challenging the unfair assumptions of the town with his quiet example. One evening during a particularly harsh windstorm, a tree branch fell across the fence, blocking the pathway to the barn. Caleb rushed outside to clear it, the wind whipping at his coat and hair. Eleanor followed behind him, carrying a lantern to light the way. Together, they worked in silence, the sound of the storm blending with the creak of the old wooden boards and the distant howl of a coyote. When the branch was finally moved and the barn doors secured, Caleb turned to see Eleanor standing beside him, her hair damp from the rain, her eyes steady and calm. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and respect. She had faced the storm alongside him, not with fear or complaint, but with quiet strength. Caleb realized that fear was not in Eleanor, but in the way others had misjudged her for so long. As the seasons changed, so did the nature of their bond. In the spring, Caleb and Eleanor worked together to plant new crops, sharing laughter and conversation as they tilled the soil and planted seeds. In the summer, they tended the garden, watered the animals, and repaired fences, learning to anticipate each other's movements and needs. In the fall, they harvested the fruits of their labor, preparing the land for the harsh winter months ahead. Through it all, Caleb saw Eleanor not as the feared widow of town legend, but as a partner, a woman whose strength and intelligence had allowed her to endure more than most could imagine. Came to admire her resilience, her quiet determination, and her ability to maintain control over her life in the face of adversity. One afternoon, as they sat in the shade of a large oak tree, Eleanor spoke of the town's perception of her. "People believe what they want to believe," she said softly. "They see what fits their story, not what is real." Caleb nodded, understanding more than he could put into words. He realized that Eleanor's fearsome reputation had been built over years of tragedy and misunderstanding, and that the town's judgment had been harsher than any actual misfortune she had caused. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of empathy for her, and a determination to stand by her, to see her for who she truly was, rather than the shadow that the town had created. Caleb also began to understand that Eleanor's strength was not just in her ability to survive, but in her ability to maintain her dignity and independence despite the rumors and isolation. She had created a life that was orderly, self-sufficient, and capable of weathering both literal and figurative storms. Caleb found inspiration in her resilience, realizing that he could learn from her example and become a stronger, more capable man in the process. Their forced marriage, which had seemed like a punishment at first, was transforming into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and mutual respect. As winter approached, Caleb and Eleanor faced new challenges. The cold winds swept across the plains, and the snow made travel difficult and dangerous. They worked together to stock firewood, repair the roof, and ensure that the animals were safe and warm. Through these shared hardships, their bond deepened. Caleb saw Eleanor's resourcefulness and practical intelligence in action, and he began to trust her judgment in ways he had never anticipated. He realized that fear had no place in their home. What mattered was cooperation, respect, and the quiet strength that each brought to their shared life. One evening after a long day of work, Caleb and Eleanor sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames contrasting with the cold wind outside. They spoke quietly, sharing memories and stories, discovering common interests, and laughing softly at small jokes. Caleb realized that this simple connection, built over months of shared effort and understanding, was the beginning of something deeper. It was not love in the traditional sense, nor was it friendship in its usual form. It was a bond forged through adversity, shaped by respect, and strengthened by the willingness to see the truth in each other rather than the rumors of the town. Caleb began to notice that Eleanor's demeanor softened in his presence. Her sharpness remained, her intelligence and strength undiminished, but there was a subtle warmth that emerged when they worked together or shared quiet moments. He saw her smile more often, speak more openly, and even offer gentle advice with a touch of humor. These small signs of trust and comfort were profoundly meaningful to Caleb, who had entered the marriage expecting fear and isolation. Instead, he had found a partner who challenged him, inspired him, and allowed him to see the world from a new perspective. Meanwhile, the town continued to whisper, but Caleb found that their opinions mattered less and less. He had seen the truth behind Eleanor's reputation, and he knew that their judgment was based on misunderstanding, fear, and a desire for easy explanations. He realized that his role was not to change the town immediately, but to live his life with integrity and fairness, demonstrating through his actions that Eleanor was not the source of misfortune, but a woman of strength, wisdom, and compassion. He felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the truth was slowly emerging, even if the town was not yet ready to accept it. By the end of the year, Caleb and Eleanor had created a life together that was both stable and rewarding. They faced challenges, overcame difficulties, and supported each other in ways that neither had anticipated. Caleb had come to understand that the forced marriage, which had seemed like an imposition, was a turning point that allowed him to see Eleanor as she truly was. And Eleanor, in turn, had begun to open herself to the possibility of trust, companionship, and quiet connection. The bond they had forged, built on respect, understanding, and shared effort, was stronger than fear, rumor, or isolation. It was the beginning of a story that neither the town nor they could have predicted, a story of resilience, truth, and the unexpected power of human connection. The first snow of winter had melted, leaving the ground muddy and the air crisp. Caleb and Eleanor moved through their routines with a rhythm they had established over months of shared work. The farm was orderly, the animals cared for, and the house warm and safe. Life at the edge of the town had become a world of its own, separated from the whispers and stares that awaited them in the village. Yet, Caleb could not ignore the truth. The town's judgment of Eleanor still lingered like a shadow. Even with all the months of proof that she was kind, capable, and fair, many townspeople still treated her as if she were dangerous. Some called her misfortune incarnate, some avoided looking at her, and a few even laughed behind their hands when Caleb mentioned her in conversation. He had grown used to it, but it gnawed at him quietly. He had grown to care for Eleanor, to respect her, and to see her truth, and the thought that she was still suffering under the weight of false rumors filled him with determination. One morning, as Caleb brought in firewood from the woods behind the property, he noticed that the fence surrounding the orchard had been damaged in a storm overnight. He called out to Eleanor, who appeared quickly, her calm composure never breaking even in the face of laborious work. Together they worked to repair the fence, hauling heavy logs and hammering nails in place. Their silence was comfortable. It was a kind of silence that comes from familiarity and shared effort. Caleb realized in that moment that Eleanor was not only a partner in life, but also a teacher. Her skill with tools, her knowledge of the land, and her steady approach to tasks impressed him deeply. He felt an urge not just to follow her lead, but to stand beside her, to protect and support her openly rather than shrinking back from the judgmental eyes of the town. After finishing the repairs, Caleb made a decision. He would no longer let fear or rumor dictate the way they lived. From now on, he would openly stand by Eleanor, showing the town that she was not the figure of dread they imagined, but a capable, strong, and kind woman. This was no small choice. It meant that he would confront prejudice and challenge the gossip that had defined her life for years. It meant that he would face ridicule and possibly hostility. Yet, the longer he watched Eleanor navigate the world with quiet grace, the more he understood that she deserved someone willing to face the world with her, rather than hiding behind walls of silence or caution. The first opportunity came sooner than he expected. That week, Caleb needed supplies from the town's general store. He had grown accustomed to riding alone, but this time he insisted that Eleanor come with him. She hesitated at first, her expression unreadable, but Caleb spoke gently, telling her that they would face whatever waited together, and so she agreed. As they rode into town on horseback, the townspeople noticed immediately. Heads turned, children stopped mid-play, and shopkeepers whispered behind counters. It was unusual to see Eleanor in the streets, and even more unusual to see Caleb beside her without fear or hesitation. Some stared in disbelief, wondering what had caused this sudden change in the young man who had once seemed so timid and respectful of the town's rules. At the store, Caleb greeted the shopkeeper warmly, while Eleanor quietly selected the items they needed. He noticed a few old neighbors trying to avoid their gaze, and a group of men whispering near the entrance, likely discussing their presence. But Caleb did not flinch. He spoke openly about the farm, asked for advice about supplies, and treated Eleanor as if she were the most natural companion in the world. His confidence was quiet, not boastful, yet it carried a message. He would no longer hide. He would no longer be influenced by fear or gossip. Eleanor, sensing his strength, mirrored his composure. She walked beside him with grace, her posture straight, her eyes clear and calm. Together they were a picture of dignity and quiet defiance, challenging the town's assumptions without uttering a single word about their intentions. Over the following days, Caleb continued this approach. He visited the town frequently, always accompanied by Eleanor. At first, the reaction was mixed. Some townspeople stared in shock, others whispered behind doors, and a few laughed or made jokes at their expense. Yet Caleb remained calm and steady. He greeted everyone politely, spoke honestly about their farm, and treated Eleanor with respect and fairness. Slowly, people began to notice the truth in his actions. He did not avoid Eleanor. He did not act embarrassed or fearful. He treated her as an equal, and through his example the town began to see that the woman they had feared for so long was no threat at all. She was simply a human being, capable, intelligent, and deserving of respect. One day, a particularly influential man in town approached Caleb with a sneer. He spoke of Eleanor's supposed misfortune and suggested that Caleb would soon regret standing by her. Caleb listened carefully, calmly, and then replied with quiet firmness. He spoke not with anger, but with reason. He reminded the man of the years Eleanor had lived quietly and fairly, the way she had helped neighbors without seeking attention, and the hard work she had put into her home and farm. The man hesitated, unaccustomed to hearing such words of defense from someone so young, and slowly the seeds of doubt began to take root. Others nearby began to reconsider their assumptions as well, realizing that Caleb's words carried truth and integrity. The town had long believed in rumor and fear, but here was someone willing to show evidence through his actions and words. Meanwhile, life on the farm continued. Caleb and Eleanor worked together to repair the fences, tend the garden, and care for the animals. Their cooperation grew stronger each day. They began to anticipate each other's needs, often completing tasks with little to no words. This silent understanding impressed Caleb more than anything else. He realized that the strength of their partnership was not built on fear or obligation, but on mutual respect, trust, and the willingness to face challenges together. Eleanor, too, seemed to relax in his presence, her guarded demeanor softening as she recognized that Caleb was not just a husband by circumstance, but a partner in life. The change did not go unnoticed by the children in town. They began to whisper less, no longer pointing and staring as openly. Adults who had once avoided Eleanor slowly greeted her politely, though still cautiously. Caleb's steady presence was changing the narrative. People began to see Eleanor not as a curse or a figure of misfortune, but as a woman of resilience, capable of kindness and deserving of respect. The transformation was slow, gradual, but undeniable. Caleb's unexpected choice to stand beside her openly was reshaping the town's perception, challenging generations of fear and rumor. One evening, after a long day tending the fields, Caleb and Eleanor sat by the fire in their home. The wind rattled the windows, and the faint smell of wood smoke filled the air. Caleb looked at Eleanor, noticing the subtle changes in her expression, a smile that lingered a moment longer, a glance that conveyed quiet understanding. He realized that their bond had grown far deeper than he had imagined possible. It was not simply companionship, nor mere tolerance. It was a partnership forged in adversity, strengthened by respect, and made resilient by the shared willingness to confront the world together. Caleb understood that the choice he had made, to openly support Eleanor, to challenge fear and rumor, had changed everything, not just for her, but for himself as well. Their new approach extended beyond the boundaries of the farm. When a harsh winter storm left families in town struggling, Caleb and Eleanor offered assistance without hesitation. They shared firewood, food, and supplies with those in need, acting with quiet generosity. The town began to notice that Eleanor was not a source of trouble, but a woman capable of compassion and fairness. Rumors began to fade in the face of her actions, reinforced by Caleb's support. Slowly, the town's perception shifted. The widow, who had once been feared, became a symbol of strength, and Caleb's decision to stand by her openly had made all the difference. As spring approached, the farm thrived. The crops grew tall and strong, the animals were healthy, and the house was warm and welcoming. Caleb and Eleanor's partnership had become a model of cooperation and respect. Neighbors began to seek their advice, children visited without fear, and even the most skeptical townspeople began to treat Eleanor with courtesy. Caleb realized that the town's story about her once full of fear and rumor, had been rewritten not through words alone but through steady, courageous action. His unexpected choice to stand beside Eleanor had challenged long-held beliefs, proving that truth and kindness could overcome fear and prejudice. Through it all, Caleb understood that the path they had chosen was not easy. There were challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of tension, yet each obstacle strengthened their bond. Eleanor's trust in him grew, and Caleb's admiration for her deepened. Together they had begun to create a new legacy, one that would not be defined by fear or rumor, but by courage, respect, and the quiet power of standing for what is right. The young man who had been compelled into a feared marriage had chosen a different path, a path of bravery and integrity, and in doing so he had changed not only his own life, but the life of the woman he had once thought he would fear. Winter had passed, and the first green shoots of spring were appearing across the fields surrounding Caleb and Eleanor's home. The air was filled with the scent of fresh grass and the sound of birds returning from their long journey south. Life at the edge of the clearing had become a quiet, steady rhythm, one built from months of shared labor, mutual respect, and small moments of trust. Caleb and Eleanor had learned to move together like partners in an intricate dance, understanding each other without needing many words. Their home was warm, their farm productive, and their bond stronger than either could have imagined when the forced marriage first brought them together. Yet, while their lives at the farm were peaceful, the town remained a delicate challenge. Not all eyes were friendly, and not all hearts were ready to let go of fear and suspicion. One morning, Caleb and Eleanor rode into town to sell some of their produce. Their wagon was filled with baskets of fresh vegetables, eggs, and a few cuts of meat from the farm. The townspeople noticed them immediately. Children stopped their play to stare. Women whispered to each other, and men paused their work to watch the couple pass. There was a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and disbelief in the air. For the first time in months, Caleb sensed a quiet tension that felt heavier than usual. Some influential men in the town still refused to believe that Eleanor had changed, still clinging to old rumors of misfortune, and today, it seemed, one of them had made up his mind to challenge the progress Caleb had quietly nurtured. At the market, a well-known landowner, Mr. Harlow, stepped forward. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and a reputation for stirring trouble. "So, this is the widow," he said, his voice loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "And the young man thinks he can tame her? You'll regret this, boy." Caleb felt a flicker of anger but held himself steady. He had learned in the months of life with Eleanor that anger did not win battles. Calmness, fairness, and action did. He turned to Mr. Harlow and spoke firmly but without malice. "Eleanor is no curse, no danger. She is a good woman, hard-working and fair. I stand with her because she deserves respect, nothing more or less. Your stories are just that. Stories. They do not match the truth I have seen." The market went silent. Some people whispered quietly, others stared in shock. The firmness in Caleb's voice, combined with the sincerity in his eyes, began to shift the mood. Eleanor, standing beside him, met Mr. Harlow's gaze calmly, her presence quiet but commanding. It was clear that she no longer feared his judgment, and that she had the unwavering support of Caleb, a young man many had assumed would bend to fear. The confrontation marked a turning point. People began to reconsider their long-held assumptions about Eleanor. She was no longer simply the subject of fear and gossip. Caleb's unwavering loyalty had demonstrated that she was trustworthy, capable, and deserving of respect. Slowly, neighbors approached the couple, asking about life on their farm or seeking advice on their own crops. Even Mr. Harlow seemed momentarily disarmed, though he made no public concession. Caleb knew that change would not happen overnight, but he also knew that truth had a quiet, steady power. Eleanor's reputation, once forged in rumor, was beginning to be rewritten by action and consistency rather than whispers. Back at the farm, life continued with a sense of purpose. Caleb and Eleanor worked tirelessly, improving the land, repairing fences, and tending the animals. Their partnership had evolved into something deeper than mere convenience. They began to anticipate each other's needs, completing tasks almost instinctively. Caleb admired Eleanor's intelligence, patience, and unwavering determination. He realized that the woman the town had feared was also the woman who had quietly shaped their life into something strong and sustainable. Eleanor, in turn, began to show small signs of warmth that she had hidden behind years of isolation. She laughed softly at Caleb's occasional jokes, offered advice in gentle tones, and began to include him in decisions about the farm's future. Their connection was no longer dictated by circumstance, but by choice and mutual respect. Spring turned into summer, and the farm flourished. The crops grew tall and healthy, and the animals thrived under careful attention. Caleb and Eleanor's teamwork became a model for others in the area. When travelers or merchants passed through, they would often comment on the productivity of the farm and the obvious harmony between the couple. Slowly, the town began to accept that Eleanor's presence was not to be feared. Children who had once avoided the edge of the property now waved shyly. Adults greeted her with cautious smiles, and even skeptical neighbors began to ask for advice or assistance. Caleb's choice to stand openly by Eleanor had changed the story the town had long believed. Fear and rumor were being replaced by respect and admiration. One particularly hot afternoon, a fire broke out in the small woods near the edge of the property. The flames threatened to reach the farm if left unchecked. Caleb and Eleanor acted immediately, bringing water, shovels, and blankets to create fire breaks. They worked tirelessly together, side by side, until the danger had passed. Their bravery did not go unnoticed. Neighbors who had once whispered about Eleanor's supposed misfortune came to offer help and praise. "She's no curse," one man said quietly. "She's a strong woman, and that boy beside her, he's got courage." The words echoed Caleb's own feelings. He had always known that Eleanor's strength was real, but to hear the town acknowledge it aloud was a moment of quiet triumph. Through the summer, Caleb and Eleanor's bond deepened even further. They shared meals in the warmth of the sun, walked the fields discussing future plans, and even began to teach the children of the town small lessons about farming, animals, and respect for the land. Eleanor's intelligence and patience were evident to all who interacted with her, and Caleb's steady support continued to challenge old prejudices. Together, they were no longer just a married couple. They were partners, leaders, and examples of what could happen when trust and respect overcame fear. As fall approached, the couple prepared for the harsh winter months. They stored firewood, preserved food, and ensured that all animals had shelter. The farm was in excellent condition, a testament to their hard work, planning, and cooperation. Caleb reflected on how far they had come. A year ago, he had entered this life under duress, fearful of the feared widow at the edge of town. Now, he saw not a figure of dread, but a woman of intelligence, courage, and quiet compassion. Eleanor, in turn, had opened herself to the possibility of companionship, trust, and even joy. Together, they had weathered both the literal storms of the plains and the figurative storms of rumor and fear. The final test came during a town gathering that marked the beginning of harvest season. Eleanor and Caleb attended, standing together proudly. Some townspeople looked at them with curiosity, others with skepticism, but the overall mood was different from what it had been months earlier. No longer were they whispered about in fear. Now many looked upon them with respect. During the gathering, a minor dispute arose between two men over the ownership of a small piece of land. Without hesitation, Caleb and Eleanor stepped in calmly, offering reasoned advice and fair solutions. Their involvement resolved the conflict peacefully, earning them public gratitude. The townspeople began to recognize the wisdom, fairness, and capability that Eleanor possessed, not as a source of misfortune, but as a strength to be valued. By the end of the day, Caleb and Eleanor were no longer seen as outsiders or objects of fear. They had earned a place of respect and admiration in the town, not through words alone, but through steady, consistent action, courage, and integrity. Eleanor's reputation had transformed completely. The widow once feared for her supposed misfortune was now recognized as a woman of remarkable strength, wisdom, and kindness. Caleb, the young man who had been compelled into marriage, had become a symbol of loyalty, courage, and fairness. Together, they had changed not only their own lives, but the hearts and minds of everyone around them. Years later, travelers passing through the town would often hear the story of the young man who had been forced to marry a feared widow. They would learn how Caleb's unexpected choice to stand by Eleanor, openly and without fear, had transformed her life and reshaped the town's perception. They would hear how two people, through patience, hard work, and quiet bravery, had overcome fear, rumor, and misunderstanding to build a life of trust, respect, and partnership. Caleb and Eleanor's home at the edge of the clearing was no longer isolated, but a place of welcome, strength, and wisdom. Visitors were greeted with kindness, and the story of their courage became part of the town's history. In the end, the forced marriage that had seemed like a burden became the foundation for something far greater. Caleb had chosen to see Eleanor for who she truly was, rather than the fears and rumors of others. He had challenged prejudice, faced skepticism, and acted with courage and integrity. Eleanor, in turn, had opened her heart to trust, partnership, and quiet joy. Together they had proven that respect, truth, and understanding could overcome fear and rumor, and that even in a world full of judgment, love and courage could thrive. Their story remained a lesson for generations. Sometimes the bravest choice is simply to stand by someone, see the truth in them, and face the world together.